even, and I think Islam, if I may go to Islam, because I think it's really kind of
Connected.
intimately tied to this, that even
Yes.
Islam, in many contexts, I would say, I don't want to say in all contexts, but it seems to me that in most contexts, if not all, it is also about this exclusivity of worship. It is not just a submission in a general sense of, a resignation to God's will, or, promising I'll follow whatever God says. But it seems to me that it is also about monotheism. So in a sense, Islam seems to be a synonym of akhlas ad-din, dedicated deen alone. Islam seems to be doing the same thing. I mean, in many, many passages, I think they appear together. Pharaoh, when he's drowning, he says, "Oh, I have believed, I confess that there is no deity but what the Banu Israel have believed in, and I am min al-Muslimin, I'm from the Muslimin." And then it's like, too late. You should have done that before. But in many contexts, Islam, I think, is really about serving only Allah. And I think it may even have had a maybe primarily also cultic dimension, in the sense that you devote, it's like almost a whole burnt offering. You burn the whole thing to the deity. You devote the worship only to Allah, but also there is obviously the intellectual dimension, there is a spiritual dimension. But I think there is a sense of complete devotion and dedication of your acts of worship, but also obviously non-cultic. There's non-cultic service. People can serve God by paying towards his cause. So in the Quran, we have the بِأَمْوَالِهِمْ وَأَنفُسِهِمْ. People can serve God with their properties, with their own lives even. They can fight in battle and die in the path of God, which I think, again, for us is very abstract. But in that milieu, one of the main, it has a very concrete thing. In the path of Allah means in the path of basically going back to Allah's sanctuary. They were in Medina, they were fighting to get into the sanctuary of Allah.
In Mecca.
So there is exactly, so Baytullah, So
interesting.
This was also another aspect.
Yeah. So you make the point in regard to Islam, especially that there is sometimes an assumed idea that it refers to something passive. So
yes, exactly.
As a servant or slave of Allah, I'll simply subject myself or submit myself to whatever he wills. And there may be some of that, but you argued that if we think more of devotion or dedicating oneself to God, it has more of this active aspect.
Exactly.
Very
and there's this really interesting verse, if I may add, in Surah Al-An'am, which I think really sums up things really well, in which the Prophet is asked to say, indeed, my salat, my nusuk, which are maybe the kind of rituals and maybe sacrifices,
interesting word,
as well as my life and death belong to Allah. Inna salati wa nusuki wa mahyaya wa mamati lillahi rabbil alameen. And then the next verse, he goes on to say, I have been commanded to this, wa ana, I think, awwalul muslimin or min al muslimin, I forget, but I am one of the Muslimun. So it's really this notion of I give everything only to Allah. There is this exclusivity to it that I think submission also doesn't capture. So I think submission doesn't capture two things. It doesn't capture the cultic connotations of Islam. Sometimes it has the notion of, when I'm doing my salat, maybe the mushrikun do their salat differently. Maybe in their salat they call on other beings, but the Prophet is only calling on Allah. In his nusuk also, when he's consecrating the animal, he's only consecrating it to Allah. And then also in his life and death more broadly. So it's not just cultic. But Islam has this exclusivity to it that I don't think submission conveys. I mean, we can say that complete submission maybe would be at least better, but
yes. Okay. I have sort of a theological observation which you might react to if you want, and then a comparative observation, if I remember that. But the first one, the sort of theological one, is circling back to the famous verse by tradition given to the Prophet by God at the farewell pilgrimage, where he says, "Al-yawma akmaltu lakum dinakum,
exactly.
al-islam dinan."
Exactly.
That is taken by some, let's say, more of a Salafi sort of tendency to say that, Islam is completely given to the Prophet and his companions.
Right.
And so our job is basically to sort of vigilantly neither add nor subtract from it.
Right.
But I mean there's a major change on, it seems to me, on that verse and its implications for carrying out a life pleasing to God, if the deen there, and also the Islam that comes up at the end of the verse, is a reference principally to cultic actions. It means that there could be space. Again, this is theological, and I'm a non-Muslim, so I probably don't have the right to say it, but there could be space for continual theological reflection, also legal reflection about how to best carry out Islam in the current context. Does that make sense? I don't know.
Absolutely. I'm actually glad you mentioned that verse again, because so I've written a paper on this. I'll try to kind of summarize some just to briefly some of the main points. So I think, again, that verse, there's been this perceived disjuncture between the beginning of the verse and the end of the verse. So the beginning of the verse basically enumerates 11 things that are forbidden to the believers, and 10 of them have to do with food items, maybe even
this
the
is Quran 5:3, just to remind
exactly
everyone.
The third verse of Surah 5. So it says, it is forbidden to you to consume carrion, blood, flesh of swine, what has been consecrated to other than Allah, what has been beaten or fallen or gored to death, what has been maybe sacrificed on nusuk. I kind of forget. There's 10 items, and then the verse goes on to say, today I have perfected your deen for you, and I'm pleased with Islam as your deen. And a lot of people have said there doesn't seem to be a good connection between the beginning and the end. Some people have said
legal bits, and then there's sort of what seems to be a majestic proclamation of finality or completion.
Exactly. And so there's the idea, this is later insertion, maybe the maybe it's post-prophetic. Fred Donner has suggested in an article that maybe it's post-prophetic. So here's how I understand the verse. I think if we go back to Surah Al-An'am, which I think is a really important surah, because it is one of the few surahs in which we see the tip of the cultic iceberg, basically. So because a lot of it the Quran doesn't mention. Just as it doesn't mention any of the genealogy. The Quran just mentions the Quraysh, but I think everybody agrees that this was a tribal society. Tribal politics was really important, but the Quran doesn't attend to that aspect. And I think similarly, the cultic aspect is behind a lot of these terms, but the details are not given except in Surah Al-An'am. And in Surah Al-An'am, the Quran takes issue with some of the practices of the mushrikun. And one of the things that the Quran takes issue with and really uses strong language about is that the believers should not eat the meat of an animal if God's name has not been invoked over it. And it says, do not eat from that over which God's name has not been invoked. And then it says that, the demons are arguing with their followers, meaning the mushrikun presumably, to argue with you and maybe make you eat it. But if you do this, you will be mushrikun. This is very important. If you eat the meat of an animal over which Allah's name has not been invoked, you will be mushrikun. That's what the Quran says.
Right.
So this is a very grave and very serious thing. And I think it is serious because there is this suspicion in the Quran that when the pagans are not invoking Allah's name, they are invoking the name of other beings. So they are offering the animal in service, in the worship of other beings. So this is part of the deen of other beings, service to other beings. And the Quran says this is a vital thing, because I think for us in the era of industrialized slaughter, in the era of non-sacrificial worship, it may be very strange to us why animal meat was so important. But in the ancient world, animal meat was really important. It was pregnant with religious meaning. And it was very easy to slip into pagan worship if you did it the wrong way. So the Bible also, prohibits the Israelites from slaughtering their animals in the book of Leviticus, slaughtering their animals in the desert, it says, because you'll engage in demon worship or the worship of goats or illicit worship. So you should worship them by the tabernacle. This is very important. It has to be supervised. You have to do it the proper way.
You should slaughter them, you mean. You said worship, but I think you meant slaughter. Yeah.
Exactly. But basically sacrifice, because they have to slaughter it as sacrifices of well-being. Zibhei shlamim. So by the tabernacle. So when we consider that context, when we look at Surah Al-An'am, in which this is so important, then we go back to Surah Al-Ma'idah. Now, the Quran in 3 other passages has said, these are the only things that you should not eat, 4 items, which Nikolai Sina has called the Quran's dietary tetralogue. It's carrion, it's blood, it's flesh of swine, and it's something consecrated to other than Allah. But it seems that what happens in in the beginning of Surah Al-Ma'idah is that the Quran also bans animals that have been captured through hunting. Like the first and second verse of Al-Ma'idah basically say, why do you do hunting during the holy, while you are in Hurum, while you are in a state of sanctity? So they ban hunting, and I think the third verse also is related to hunting. It bans when it says, animals that are beaten to death or fallen to death and so on. I don't think, they could be natural death in the wild, but it may also be death from violent hunting. So it says that you should not do that. And it seems to suggest that that's almost a pagan practice. And it goes on to say, not only are you not allowed to eat these, why not? Because again, when an animal dies during hunting, God's name is not invoked over it. It's over. The animal is, so
Good
you do
point.
not, the animal has to be slaughtered properly while it is alive, and the name of God should be mentioned over it. And hunting or death in the wild does not allow for that. So you have to make sure. And so the Quran departs in a major way from its dietary tetralogue and basically lays out a cultic decalogue, if we can call it that, 10 food items.
Yes.
And then the result is that they have to make sure that the meat that they eat comes from animals that are very explicitly slaughtered, and the slaughter includes the invocation of Allah's name. And the next verse, interestingly, seems to suggest that they were puzzled by this. They asked, well, يَسْأَلُونَكَ مَاذَا أُحِلَّ لَهُم. They ask you what has been, what is then allowed to them? They're almost polemically asking, well, you've outlawed everything now. And the Quran says, no, قُلْ أُحِلَّ لَكُمُ الطَّيِّبَاتِ. The طَيِّبَات are still good for you. You can do hunting. However, only if your dogs are trained, if your hounds are trained and they catch it for you, and you can mention the name of God. فَكُلُوا مِمَّا أَمْسَكْنَا عَلَيْكُمْ وَاذْكُرُوا اسْمَ اللَّهِ عَلَيْهِ. Mention the name of God. So it's really important to mention the name of Allah only, exclusively. And then it's precisely because of that, the Quran is almost trying to justify why it is departing in a major way from its tetralogue, and it goes for this more stringent decalogue, and it says, this is important because it is to distinguish your way of worship from the pagans, and to make sure that you are adhering to Islam, which is exclusive worship of Allah, that you do not engage in, maybe you do not eat the meat of animals that have been secretly, or at least not explicitly consecrated to Allah. So it's really important to make, these are the kind of guardrails to make sure that they're not like the believers. So that is what it means.
That cultic dimension.
Exactly. And in Surah An-Nur, there is a similar verse in which it says, I will kind of give them power, and then I will grant them the deen that I have ارتضى لهم يعبدونني لا يشركون بي شيئا. So it is not about religion as such. It's about the worship of God, in my view, and about the exclusive worship of God. And the Quran justifies it.
If I can jump in there, it's really, really enlightening, and the implications are profound. It seems to me there's some parallels here, and you bring it up, this comparison up in a way in the article, between Jewish conversations around Jerusalem and then the later development of Judaism after the destruction of the temple in AD 70, in as much as well, the way you bring it up, and maybe this will help us move towards Hanif, the last of the 3 terms we promised to speak about. But the way you bring it up is, for Jews, Jerusalem is the proper place to worship God, the proper place for ritual sacrifice. Even if before the dedication of Jerusalem to God, you could worship anywhere in the land of Israel, but with Jerusalem, with the establishment of Jerusalem, I mean, especially with Solomon and the building of the temple, Jerusalem is the place. And you even refer to in the Gospel of John, where Jesus speaks to the Samaritan woman and alludes to sort of the Christian vision of worshiping God anywhere in spirit and in truth. So anyway, you bring it up in the article as a way of commenting on potential Jewish reticence about the Meccan sanctuary, and in particular, the fact that cultic practices take place there, including the ritual sacrifice of animals. But also, I mean, it strikes me that maybe it's a little more theological as well, so you might not want to go there. But I mean, Jews have obviously developed ways of rethinking their practice in the absence of a temple. And obviously there's a whole flowering of rabbinic Judaism, the growth of synagogues, which obviously existed before, but then become more central in some ways. So that, I mean, in Judaism today, for the most part, Jews would say, yeah, you sort of worship God anywhere. There's no more ritual sacrifices. And it seems to me that that is somewhat parallel to something we were speaking about earlier, whereas Muslims in the contemporary period, or really for centuries now, understand, you know, even with the Hajj and the rites of the Hajj in particular, which does include for the Adha, the sacrifice of an animal, but still there's this notion that Islam can be practiced effectively anywhere, and one might lose a bit the 7th century perspective of the centrality of the Meccan sanctuary. So I don't know if you want to comment on that. It's not a really good lead up, but if you want to comment on that comparison maybe, and then maybe we can move towards Hanif. I don't know, maybe I shouldn't ask you to do both at the same time. So any comments on that comparison first, and then we'll speak about Hanif.
So no, I think that's an excellent comparison. You know, this movement after the temple is destroyed, and you know, this seems that public sacrifices at least stop, maybe even private ones, and then different modes of devotion, you know, grow in the Jewish community. So I think what happens in the case of you are right, in the case of early Islam is also similar, because when Islam expands, really, the Meccan sanctuary inevitably loses some of its centrality. It's not a palpable presence anymore. But interestingly, I think because of the experience of the Medinan period, in which the Prophet and his followers were not able to access the sanctuary on a regular basis, apparently, that already kind of salat is you know, is a really important ritual. Now people face the Meccan sanctuary, you know, by way of being there. You know, I think salat, it's almost like saying that salat should be done by the Meccan sanctuary. Abraham brings his son Ishmael to the Meccan sanctuary, and he says, I have brought him here liyuqimu salat, so that they do the prayer. So he didn't say they can do it from the Holy Land. He had to bring it by God's sacred house, عند البيت عند بيتك المحرم, by your sacred house, so that they perform the prayer. So that ideally prayer is salat, which we can translate as prayer. Maybe we should translate as worship. You know, I think Montgomery Watt suggests that maybe worship is a better translation for salat, and I kind of agree with that. So salat ideally performed by the Meccan sanctuary, but you know, the Quran says you can face the Meccan sanctuary and perform your salat. It's almost as if you're there. So as a replacement for that, you know, you can't do that. So you can now face the Meccan sanctuary. And so that facilitates the kind of growth of a religiosity, that experience, the exilic experience of the early Muslims in Medina, almost kind of facilitates a kind of spirituality and religious devotion that is then developed much further, of course, in the post-prophetic era. But already the kind of the basis is there. I mean, you could argue, and maybe I'll talk about Hanif and then I'll come back to this, but the Hajj also remains, you know, something that at least once in a lifetime, if someone can do it, you know, they should do it. So it kind of retains some aspects in that sense more than the Jerusalem temple does, but definitely I think the loss of its centrality is very much similar to the loss of the centrality of the Jerusalem temple in Jewish worship and religiosity.